Hello and welcome to the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we're extremely lucky to be joined by Professor Rob Newton. Rob, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Oh, thanks, guys. It's good to be here this morning and have a chat to you. So I'm the Professor of Exercise Medicine at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Western Australia. Coming up, this is my 20th year at ECU. And most of my work, well, pretty much all of my work now is in the application of exercise and medicine in the management of cancer, so the field of exercise oncology. And I don't do much athlete work these days. The first half of my year, the first 20 years, was in predominantly in high performance biomechanics and high performance athletes. And over the last 20 years, I've focused more and more in terms of the clinical aspects of applying exercise as a medicine.
It's interesting you say that because I think one of the things that's most impressive about the broad work that you've done is that there is such a level of continuity that shifts between health and performance. But I think often people don't put that association together. And I think your work has really highlighted that clearly. Particularly in that shift. And was there a reason or something that sparked you wanting to actually go towards working as exercise as medicine or exercise in the health space?
Yeah, there was a pretty strong motivation, I think, that, and some would be 27 years ago now. Well, actually, 29 years ago, my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and he had a prostatectomy, so the removal of his prostate, and then he had radiation therapy for 6 weeks. And uh, whilst it cured his prostate cancer, he had this overwhelming fatigue, and he just came home and he sat in the sun at the front of the house, and he was retired by then. And I just watched his physical condition decline, and as an exercise scientist, I said, Dad, come on, let's go for a walk, or would you do some weights, or can we go do some sort of physical activity? And he said, no, my doctor told me to rest. And I said, well, we need to talk to your doctor because this is not working. You're getting weaker, and you could see his muscle wasting, and his functional capacity getting worse and worse. And but at the time, the doctor said, no, that's fatigue. You're tired. You need to rest and recover from your cancer and the treatments. And I think every fibre of my being as an exercise scientist was that this was wrong.
Hmm.
Humans aren't meant to just sit. And so 2 years later, he died of a stroke. And this is a common sequence that we see in that. I'm not being critical of the medical profession, or certainly of his urologist. They were working on their best clinical knowledge at the time, which was that patients with cancer that have fatigue or just going through treatment, have been treatment, need to rest and recover. But of course, all of the other chronic diseases start to take off. And of course, what killed him was cardiovascular disease, or in this case, vascular disease through stroke. And so that was the impetus for me to, we'll say, there's got to be a better way. And so that got me very, very much interested in the applications of exercise as a medicine. Clinical exercise medicine or clinical exercise physiology was not well developed back then, 20, 30 years ago. Certainly, clinical exercise physiologist wasn't a profession. Accredited exercise physiologist, if you like, in Australia didn't exist as a profession. But I just saw the potential there, and I did a postdoc in Pennsylvania and University of Pennsylvania. And I was working with elite athletes. I was working with very, very high-end basketball athletes and volleyball athletes, actually. And some of them ended up in the NBA. Some went on, were playing for the US in the Olympic teams. And I got at that stage, I did run a study with old men, and we looked at applying, I guess, what you call athlete training protocols with these old men. And we actually had them. I had them doing jump squats, which was a bit unheard of because back then we are talking almost 20, 30 years ago. It was not. The aerobic conditioning mode was predominant. If you wanted to be fit, you go out and jog or you play squash. And resistance training was not really being implemented. And so it's quite unusual to implement heavy resistance training with these men. Most were in their 70s, but then to actually have them do jump squats. And we had them doing jump squats with weights. And phenomenal, the actual responses in the neuromuscular system. They become much stronger, much more explosive. And so that got me quite interested in the applications of high-performance training and taking those across to the clinical setting. So when I was recruited to Edith Cowan University in 2003, I started to implement exercise programs and trials with patients with cancer. And our first trials were in men with prostate cancer. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's how I ended up working
it's
in
fantastic to get
exercise
that
oncology.
history. Yeah, that's fantastic to get that history, because I think it's one of the things that people often confuse the application of training principles as if it changes as you get older. And Jack and I actually recently just recorded a podcast. It was just him and I having a discussion about the fact that there seems to be this weird perception that your adaptability goes to zero as you know, maybe once you get past 60 or 70. And it's just not the case. You know, the patients that we work with, the clientele that we work with are very much, you know, following in the footsteps of what your research has continually shown, which is that you maintain your ability to improve and to get stronger and to improve, you know, powerful and explosive behavior even as you get older. Now, it's probably not going to get to the same level as what you were when you were 25 or 30, that's clear, but you don't lose that ability to adapt to the application of training. Your research has obviously looked at many areas of how these kind of application to obviously oncological populations. But for our listeners, can you describe, you know, some of those changes that actually occur as you get older in response to things like resistance training, and if it changes, why it changes, and what's the degree to which it does change your ability to adapt?
Certainly. Well, we do retain incredible capacity to respond to training and adapt right throughout life. And the changes in ability really don't really kick in till about people get into their fifth or sixth decade. And then you know, obviously their ability to increase their physical performance starts to decline, and that's just evidence if you take any record at all, whether it be the marathon or the 100 meters, we do see a gradual decline. But to be honest, there's not much difference in the 100-meter record time between the Olympic athlete, for example, and someone who's in their 70s. We're only talking 5 to 10 seconds difference. So we still retain this incredible ability. Now, why does it decline as we age? Principally because of changes in our immune system. So our immune system starts to age, and we're no longer able to respond in the same way. There are some changes, aging of our endocrine system, for example. And although in males, testosterone, the main anabolic hormone, doesn't decline that much. I mean, even in old men, very old men, their levels of testosterone are still quite a wide spectrum, and some still, most retain, levels of testosterone close to what they were when they were younger. So that hormone doesn't decline too much, but it's just a general decrease in the ability of the body to respond to training, to adapt and repair and remodel. Driven
When you
predominantly
mention
by
the
aging
immune
of our immune
system,
system and endocrine systems.
when you mention the immune system, what specific changes do we see as we age? What are we seeing that would not allow so much adaptive capability?
Well, just certainly the capacity of our body to produce the same quantity and quality of T cells and natural killer cells.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very, very important in terms of the repair of tissues and reduction in levels of satellite cells as well, also, and just the overall aging of our various bodily systems.
With that in mind, Rob, I think this is a good opportunity then to talk about this idea of exercise as medicine, because I think a lot of people, when they think of exercise, they think about running faster, running further, getting bigger muscles. But when we provide mechanical stimulus to our body, we upregulate our immune system. And that can have a lot of effects on other systems within our body. Can you actually just describe in a bit more detail how exercise influences the immune system and how that creates adaptations in other parts of our body?
Sure. So it's interesting because I get a bit of joking pushback from some of my medical colleagues and say, well, exercise is not really a medicine, is it? But it is, because it creates enormous chemical changes within the body, of course, and those enormous changes are highly coordinated. And as you well know, any exogenous, so from the outside drug, has side effects. Every drug, even aspirin, has side effects. Even normal dose aspirin, I think the statistics are about 1 in 860 people taking normal dose aspirin each day to control, for example, it's given to reduce risk of heart attack. 1 in 860 will have an intestinal bleed, a hemorrhage. So every drug has a side effect when it's taken exogenously. The beautiful thing about exercise as a medicine is that the drugs are produced endogenously within the body, and they're produced in harmony with all of the other systems which are going on. So the analogy I like to use is if you can imagine an orchestra, you've got this magnificent orchestra, and when we exercise, they're all playing Beethoven beautifully. Every instrument's in tune. They have their different roles, different parts of the symphony. When you introduce a drug, it's like putting a harmonica in the middle of the orchestra, and it's a little bit out of tune, and it's playing a different song. So that's why it's difficult to manipulate just a single chemical pathway without interfering with something somewhere else in the body. Certainly, pharmaceuticals are absolutely crucial. The research that's been done has been able to, push back a vast majority of diseases. Metformin, for example, is an incredible drug which has been able to improve the quality and quantity of life of people who are diabetic, for example. But it's not without its considerable side effects. Exercise, though, produces huge changes internally, chemically, within the body, principally through hormonal actions, the production of various hormones, but also signalling pathways through chemicals called cytokines. We know that when we exercise, our muscles pour out hundreds of different molecules called myokines in this case, because they're released from muscle. And they signal to every other tissue in the body. And they interact very intimately with the immune system to then, for example, in the suppression of cancer, they signal to our exercise produces increases in natural killer cells circulating the body, and then these chemicals released from the muscle, the myokines, then actually signal to those natural killer cells to be more vigilant and to infiltrate the tumour and to destroy the cancer cells. And that's one of the main mechanisms by which exercise is a medicine, to actually suppress the progression of cancer growth. And that's just two mechanisms there. Another key one also is the action of increased blood pressure and cardiac output, causing stress on the blood vessels. That, of course, causes the production of nitric oxide and a whole lot of conditioning and improvement in the vascular system. So that's why exercise is so effective at keeping our arteries in particular, and our heart, the arteries around our heart, healthy and clean. If you like, clean as in cleaning out the plumbing. And it's the exercise, and in that case, it's just the physical stretching of those arteries through the increase in the blood pulse, which keeps those structures healthy. In cancer, we know that that process actually helps to develop a more normal blood flow through solid tumours. And this is absolutely critical because it allows our body system to put more anti-cancer factors into the tumour. Tumours are normally quite hypoxic. They have poor blood flow. They're poor vascular perfusion. And so this is a problem because it makes cancers harder to treat. They're very resistant to different treatments like chemotherapy and radiation therapy. But exercise actually increases or improves the circulation of blood, and that increases the effectiveness of chemotherapy and radiation therapy. So, in my opinion, exercise is a medicine.
Did you expect that when you started to design the application in this oncological setting? Because that was the thing that surprised me the most. I remember starting to read some of your research, probably in the 2007, 2008, around there, and being really surprised at the effect it was having, as you said, on people's ability to tolerate things like chemotherapy and the effectiveness of it, and how much effect it was having not only just actually on how the person felt and the management of fatigue, but actually the actual response they were having to fighting the cancer itself. Like, was that something that you expected, or was that a nice byproduct of applying exercise with your exercise physiologist kind of hat on, thinking, oh, this will help them actually manage their physical function?
Absolutely, totally unexpected.
That's such
The
a cool
initial
finding.
focus of my research, yeah, I mean, it just came out of left field. The initial research that I was doing was purely tried to maintain strength and function in these patients because cancer itself, the disease, and many of the treatments causes loss of muscle mass and function, decrease in physical activity, and then, of course, you have a cascade down. And then, as my dad did, the patient ends up dying of something else, in this case, vascular disease. But as we went along, and as the field's grown, and in particular, it's been driven by trying to understand why cancer survivors that are physically active are much less likely to die of their cancer. We know that if anyone's more physically active, whether they're cancer or not, they're less likely to die of anything. But what was surprising was research that was published around 2010, where there was an association. In one particular study, there was a 60% reduced risk of dying specifically of their prostate cancer in men that did vigorous physical activity. So it was at that point that people went, how the hell does that work? And that's when there was a lot in particular of preclinical models, in other words, animal models and cellular models, to try and have a look and say, well, how is exercise actually altering tumour biology and changing the actual expression of the cancer cells? And so that's launched a huge volume of research now, which is increasingly being done in humans now, because now we're actually applying it in humans to look in actual clinical models to translate what's been found in preclinical models across to see if it applies. And then that's what we're finding, is we're starting to really understand how exercise in probably through about 12 different mechanisms, including genetic and epigenetic alterations, preservation of telomere lengths of immune cells, etc., that through these 12 or so mechanisms, exercise as a medicine is directly influencing tumour and cancer cell biology.
The thing I find amazing about exercise too, and to appreciate how complex it is I know there's been a lot of research to try and create a drug to mimic the molecular responses to exercise, yet that actually hasn't been very successful. And I think that really highlights what you mentioned before about exercise has almost been like an orchestral response, where there are so many signals in certain amounts in response to other, say, cytokines, and there's just so many moving parts. It's actually quite hard to replicate that through a drug, and therefore it amazes me that how much it can be underestimated how effective exercise can be, considering too it's also quite simple in terms of what needs to be done, though people's desire to do exercise might be sometimes a limiting factor.
In terms of
Sure.
well, you mentioned with exercise itself, we keep saying exercise, and you mentioned vigorous exercise. Can you describe the kind of protocols that you found the most effective in the work that you've done?
Wow, that's a
It's a
very
big question.
it's a big question. Look, I think also what we found is that the generic recommendation for cancer patients is good. It's better than nothing. The current guidelines is that all patients with cancer and cancer survivors should be active on most, if not every day of the week. They should be physically active. and they should aim to do 75 minutes of vigorous to 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, aerobic exercise, and 2 or more resistance training sessions per week, exercising all the major muscle groups. That's the generic recommendation, and that was a good recommendation. The issue was it's the exact same guideline as what's provided for healthy adults. And it doesn't take into account the fact that, someone with cancer, particularly if they're undergoing difficult treatments, there's no possible way they're able to achieve that. And actually, if they tried to do that, there could be actually negative effects, not exactly side effects, but they might have it might slightly compromise their immune system, for example. And so that's when we started to look, well, hang on, you wouldn't do that with an athlete. Well, you don't take an athlete and give them this is a generic program. It doesn't matter whether you're a weightlifter or a marathon runner, everyone gets the same training program. Well, that's nonsensical. You wouldn't, even a layperson wouldn't expect a strength and conditioning specialist to do that. Why do we then throw, a generic recommendation to a person that's potentially dying of cancer? And so that's when, we started to delve down into making a more tailored or precision exercise medicine approach. And the underpinnings of that were exactly what we do with athletes. If you have an athlete, you're preparing them for, the grand final at the end of the season, for example, preparing them for the season, let's choose a time point event like the Olympic Games. Is that you assess the athlete across all of the key. First off, you determine what are the key qualities of physical attributes that are important to their sport, to their success. You then assess those attributes through different characteristics that contribute to that, and then you find out their strengths and weaknesses, and you focus on their weaknesses. It's the same with our management now of cancer patients. Is we do extensive health and fitness assessment on them, and then we determine what are those health issues or decrements which are most likely to cause their morbidity or their mortality. And then you focus laser-like on that. You don't worry about all the other things. Let's do a little bit of aerobic, a little bit of strength training, a little bit of balance training. No. You focus in on what is most likely to kill a patient. And, for example, a great example is the issue of low muscle mass in these patients. They've got cancer that can cause loss of muscle mass, mainly due to the energy demands of the cancer tissue itself, but also because the cancer produces substances which are catabolic. And so they got low muscle mass, and so you have to focus on that laser-like, because we know there's a strong correlation between the amount of muscle mass that the patient has and whether they're going to survive. In fact, the relationship between muscle mass and survival is stronger than the relationship between fat mass and survival. And so you wouldn't give a whole lot of aerobic conditioning to that patient. If they're sarcopenic, you have to turn that around. Cachexia, about 1 in 3 cancer patients, breast cancer patients, colorectal cancer patients, about 1 in 3 will be cachetic. In other words, they'll have this wasting of overall body tissue, including muscle. The last thing that you would give to that patient is aerobic exercise. But if you have a look at a lot of the guidelines around the world, they are that patients who do have cachexia, in the main, they are quite unwell and they do have overwhelming fatigue. And so the recommendation is to do a lot of low-intensity aerobic exercise. But that's making the condition worse, and it's the wrong medicine. And so that's where we've started to get this point of really determining what is the key issue facing the patient, and then to work laser-like on that. The analogy I use is, if the transmission's about to drop out of your car, you don't take it to the mechanic and ask them to change the seat covers. You focus on what's most likely going to end up cause you to be stopped on the side of the road in the middle of the night.
With that in mind, Rob, you talk about low muscle mass. Are there guidelines now about how much muscle mass an individual should have based on age? Because I think of, say, bone, there's a lot of good data out there of looking at being able to quantify bone, looking at it relative to a normal range within an age group and seeing whether you're above and below. Is there similar stuff coming out or similar data coming out now for muscle mass as well?
Yeah, there's fairly good indices of sarcopenia. So it is more about whether the patient is pre-sarcopenic or is sarcopenic, and it's based around at the moment the international guidelines are around a CT scan of the lumbar spine, and it looks at the muscle mass or muscle cross-sectional area there in the lumbar spine, hand grip strength, and walking speed, and a few other things. And that's sort of been the accepted definition. It's not a great definition, as you can imagine. Hand grip strength is, it's not really indicative of a whole body muscle mass. There's a correlation, of course, but that's when it's used from very, very large populations. Tens of thousands. Well, 10,000 people. Everything correlates with everything else at some level. So we use DEXA. So we do a full body scan using DEXA, and then we use various muscle indices around that to classify the person as being pre-sarcopenic or sarcopenic.
I really like the fact that you brought up the idea of approaching the exercise and training that these people do, whatever the background they come from, is one where you're individualizing it to the needs of that individual, and that there is an individualized needs analysis, because obviously we work across both populations for musculoskeletal injuries, but also for sports performance, and you get that question so much of should I be doing this, should I be doing that, and it's nice to hear from an expert like yourself that it doesn't matter what population you come from, it should really be based on the individual's needs analysis and what do you actually need to improve on this area, or because if you don't, then as you said, we're changing the seat covers for no reason because your transmission's about to blow up.
With the research you're doing, Rob, are you seeing a translation of this research into clinical practice? Are you starting to see now oncological departments prescribing and recommending certain exercise modalities, either say prior to a particular treatment that they get for their cancer or post-treatment?
Oh, absolutely. I think increasingly it's being translated, the research evidence, which is great to see. It's translated at different levels, though, and certainly there's huge variation across different geographical areas. And I think Australia, as is often the case, is taking the lead. I mean, for decades, Australia really led in terms of sports performance. The population our size and consistently coming in the top 10 countries in the world, often in the top 5 countries in the world in the Olympic Games. It says something for our science and practice of high performance development. Certainly not genetics. We've only got a very tiny genetic pool to pull from. So the same applies in terms of the application of exercise medicine, where we see that is being integrated at various levels at different hospitals, cancer centres, and in everyday medical and health practice, which is great to see. But I travel to other countries and it's practically non-existent. There's still many countries of the world, even quite developed countries, where the medical model still is the cut, slash and burn model. So drugs, surgery, radiation, and there's no patient supportive care at all around exercise, nutrition, and mental health, despite the fact that those 3 components of adult health are absolutely critical to the outcomes for the patient. So it is being translated, but it is taking rather slowly. And one of the reasons, of course, is that exercise medicine in particular is not well supported by the public health system. And so, if you look at Medicare, for example, the support for exercise medicine is woeful. You can get a chronic disease management plan from your general practitioner, which is 5 sessions per year funded by Medicare. But those sessions may have to be split across dietetics and other allied health consultations as well, podiatry, for example, or diabetes education, or exercise physiology. Look, it was an absolute turning point, I think, when exercise physiologists were accredited in Australia, because prior to that, like there was 2016, I'm mixing my dates up. But when the Abbott government at the time, Tony Abbott was the health minister, and he actually, after a lot of lobbying, he actually wrote into Medicare law that exercise physiologists would be included. And that was a watershed moment, because it is the accredited exercise physiologist that's the most appropriate allied health professional to assess a patient's health and fitness, and exercise prescription and monitoring. So that was a huge change, where people could actually access a highly trained, university trained, minimum 4 years professional to get exercise physiology services. But that's been slow as well. I mean, it's gradually growing now. We have, I think it's 6,000, 7,000, probably up to 8,000 now accredited exercise physiologists across Australia. That's a huge resource to support patients, in particular the management of chronic disease. I'm not, well, I probably am biased, but there's no other treatment therapy on the planet more effective than high-quality exercise medicine for the management of most chronic diseases. Type 2 diabetes, number one is exercise. Diet's exceptionally important, but number one is exercise, and in particular to build muscle mass. That's the fastest way to actually cure type 2 diabetes, and it's the only cure for type 2 diabetes. There's no other. Sarcopenia, we're going to hear more and more about this, because the world is less and less physically active, in particular in lifting heavy things. We don't have to do that anymore. We've got machines to do it. And sarcopenia will be a major disease in the future. We will have an increasing population of humans which have very low muscle mass, creating a whole range of other diseases, because we now know that the muscular system is the largest endocrine organ in the body, and the hormones and cytokines that it produces are absolutely essential to hold chronic disease at bay, in particular diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and also Alzheimer's as well. I'm really starting to get on my soapbox here. Implementing exercise as a medicine is critical. We've got to turn that around. It's the only way. It's the only way that in the short term, until we come up with nanorobots and some of the outlandish things that we're going to have to come up with, we will not be able to turn back the tide of chronic disease until we address it with high-quality exercise medicine, diet therapy, and we get a handle on mental health.
Are you optimistic about changes in our healthcare system to address the growing burden of chronic disease? Because so much of the problems that we face now are due to significant changes in our lifestyle, and you've mentioned some of them. Obviously, physical activity is now optional. Diet and most dietary options are typically of very poor quality, and you're seeing an increased burden of chronic diseases as a result. But the reality is, the way I see our healthcare system, a lot of it is still about disease care. People only access the healthcare system when they're in a chronic pathological state, and a lot of people are looking for pharmacological interventions to fix them. Do you see changes at a policy level that are making you feel optimistic about the future, that are actually trying to encourage or implement changes at a societal level for how people can modify their lifestyle and therefore prevent chronic disease?
Unfortunately, not so much in Australia. I think that the desire for that is actually waned, and I can only assume it's priorities of successive governments, which has not played the same emphasis. So, I mean, you'd all remember the healthy lifestyle programs of the 70s and 80s, or you guys probably don't, but the norm programs and things like that, which were very strong messaging across the media about being physically active, eating lots of fruits and vegetables, etc., etc. We haven't had those same programs in a long time, and Australians are slipping into a much more sedentary lifestyle. We're overwhelmed now, of course, by corporate food. I won't mention any of the names, but there is predominantly American corporations on every single street corner now. They deliberately target low SES regions because their food on the main is cheap, so they can push it into those people, and it's a clear market for them. And it's very difficult to overcome the enormous advertising budgets that these companies have to push highly processed and unhealthy food on us. And unfortunately, in Australia, I'm not seeing some great work at the moment, despite the best efforts of a whole lot of people, researchers, clinicians as well. I just don't see the same effort being made by government ministers. Certainly, I do see some very, very positive things in other countries. So I think in particular, if you have a look at what's being done in countries like Norway, Finland, Germany now has really addressed this. They've got some fantastic programs that they're implementing there. So we're seeing some great things being done overseas. Certainly Australia doesn't have the basket case of a health system that the United States does, but we really need to change our current health system away from a slash, burn and poison model of tertiary treatment to certainly one of prevention, but also the use of exercise as a medicine, diet as a medicine, and we have to get a handle on our major problem, which is now mental health, and we need to pour more resources into that. So, look, I hate to be pessimistic, but I think at the moment I'm just not seeing the desire of government to invest in these things. They're quite happy to throw money at a new drug that might cost $60,000 per year, $100,000 per year for a patient. And don't get me wrong, I think it's important that patients who have, say, a certain cancer get access to those drugs, and that the taxpayer supports that. But the issue is that the government won't put any money towards providing high quality exercise medicine. A patient who doesn't have private health insurance can still only get 5 consults with a dietitian a year, and yet now the government is considering whether to put the new weight loss drugs, the GLP-1 drugs, about supporting those through pharmaceutical benefit scheme, which is going to cost billions of dollars. And to get off my soapbox now, I will point out that I do think there's enormous potential in the new wave of weight loss drugs, but it's how that's actually implemented. There's a whole lot of issues with them, which I'm happy to talk about.
Yeah, I think what you're highlighting though too is there still is a big shift that needs to happen with, I guess it's like taking on the individual responsibility for your health and well-being. I feel like a lot of people really are looking for that drug really to give them a cure or solution to a chronic problem that's built up over time. A question I wanted to ask you, because you've mentioned it a few times, is the increase in mental health issues. Are you doing any research in that area yourself, Rob?
We do work a lot with psychologists, and one of our closest collaborators, who is actually here with me for the conference tomorrow, is a psycho-oncologist, and we do, because the impacts of cancer and the treatments can be quite substantial on mental health in these patients. And if you take men with prostate cancer, for example, the rate of suicide in those men is very, very high. And it's predominantly because of some of the side effects that occur with the drugs treatments, in particular urinary incontinence, for example, sexual dysfunction, and these things weigh very, very heavily. But also the treatments themselves, in particular, the main treatment for prostate cancer, for example, is chemical castration. So a drug is given which actually suppresses the release of testosterone or blocks its action. But testosterone is exceptionally important for brain function. And as you can imagine, testosterone makes us, both men and women, feel more confident, feel sharper. And that's what, evolution is designed it to do. When you remove that, then yeah, of course, the patient has, feelings of anxiety, depression, self-doubt, and just feeling low because you've taken away that really, really important hormone. That's just one example. There's, obviously there's a whole range of other issues in not just in cancer, but across all chronic diseases, which, have very, very strong impact on the mental health of the patient. And in many cases, the mental health problems that they endure is actually a side effect of their treatment, not the disease itself. So that treatment may be essential to stop them dying of their particular disease, but it does, in many cases, it will have psychological impact as well.
Yeah, the reason I ask is I'm not sure if you've collected any data on this specifically, but whether you see changes in individuals' mental health in response to some of the, say, exercise modalities, and thinking about how much our psycho-emotional state is influenced by our overall health and well-being that can be positively impacted by things like exercise or diet.
Oh, absolutely. I think I often quote the classic study from the University of Sydney from an outstanding researcher by the name of Professor Nailan Singh. Unfortunately, passed away. But he and his team did an incredible study where they took older people. So these, when I say older, these are people 65 plus, and they had a clinical psychologist evaluate them, and they, as expected, they found a certain proportion had clinical depression. They then divided them up into three groups. The first group, they said, well, go back to your GP, tell your GP that our clin psych has said that you have depression, the usual GP management. The second group, they said, we're going to do group exercise classes with light weights, so just light hand weights and just waving them around and getting in a group format. The third group did heavy resistance training, and they did this over a period, I can't remember, I think it was 3 months from memory. And routine GP care, 25% reduction in depression. And that was generally achieved through some form of drug therapy. The group that did light hand weights had a 40% reduction in depression. So just coming along to a group exercise session, the physiological benefits probably weren't that great because they had, they're using fairly light weights. The heavy resistance group had a 60% reduction in clinical depression. And so there's something about lifting heavy things, and it is, it is hormone and it is immune in origin, which is actually causing a considerable medicine, if you like, to push back the depression in these older folk. So you can't separate the body from the mind. Exercise has, we know, for another example. At the moment, we're seeing probably the only thing that can really delay the onset of Alzheimer's is physical activity. For the last 20 years, billions of dollars have been poured into trying to find therapy for Alzheimer's, and nothing has been produced. Not a single useful therapeutic has been produced. However, we do know that physical activity delays Alzheimer's considerably. Delays the progression, and even when you've got early stage, if you increase the physical activity, then the patient's their decline slows greatly. So at the moment, even something like Alzheimer's is impacted by physical activity and exercise. And one of the reasons is testosterone. We do know that decreases in testosterone is a contributing factor to Alzheimer's in those that are at risk, and testosterone therapy has been tried. But every time you exercise, you get a lovely burst of testosterone in both men and women, particularly when you do resistance training. And it could be that which is helping to slow the progression of Alzheimer's. Also, muscle mass when we exercise produces brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that could also be coming into play there in terms of slowing dementia, Alzheimer's and other dementias.
You might be able to answer this, Rob, because what you're highlighting here and what you mentioned before is if you look at something like muscle mass, it's so protective for overall longevity and reducing mortality. But there's a lot of research coming out, and I think of, say, David Sinclair as an example from Harvard University, where they talk about how you want to apply interventions or a diet that mitigates the release of mTOR, because mTOR is associated with aging of cells and therefore a higher likelihood of death. But then there's a paradox I see, because mTOR is really important for the increase in protein synthesis and muscle mass. I don't know if this is something that you have thought about or looked into, but Can you explain why this paradox exists? Because it seems to be there's one camp saying we should mitigate that elevation, but then there's clear evidence saying that, well, muscle mass as a clear outcome is so protective to chronic disease and aging.
It comes back to the orchestra playing the Bach symphony. Or Beethoven. I think I said Beethoven. I'm getting my composers mixed up.
Yeah, it's a problem of focusing too much just on one pathway, on one cellular pathway, perhaps.
Yeah, I better get back to Beethoven. Yeah, I mean, it clearly, sitting in front of you is the most complex machine in the current known universe, the human body, and it's evolved over billions of years, and so it is an extremely finely tuned machine. It's exceptionally complex. And, in normal life, if we look after it, if we do the right type of physical activity, the right amount and the right mode, if we eat the right foods, it's an extremely high-performing machine. It's only when we do things which we're not designed to do, such as be sedentary, that everything goes haywire and the machine breaks down. And so it's not unexpected that, if you manipulate single things like that, then you are going to come out with a bad outcome. And, it's something like the mTOR pathway there as well. You have all of these considerations of your dietary intake, how much you eat, what you eat, and when you eat it, but also the actual exercise that you do as well, which is mitigating that. So, it's the orchestra all working together. A classic example, when I talk about IL-6, for example, interleukin-6, it's a pro-inflammatory in the main signaling molecule. But when we exercise, it pours out of muscle, and it has highly suppressive effects on cancer cells, mainly through the interaction with natural killer cells. And so people say, well, IL-6, that's a bad molecule. Well, yeah, at chronic levels it is. If your IL-6 is chronically elevated, it is going to cause a whole lot of problems. But again, when you exercise, the orchestra's all playing in tune, and they're all playing the same symphony. And IL-6 does go out, but also so do a whole range of other hormones and signaling molecules go up and down, or up-regulated, down-regulated, all in tune. So again, we can't go in and pick out a single mechanism or single molecule like IL-6 or the mTOR pathway, just pick that out and look at it in isolation. It goes up or it goes down, and this is what we want to achieve. It's got to interact. It's in the actual systemic soup.
The chemical milieu. Yeah, the chemical milieu that will then influence the response of a particular molecule at that tissue level. I think another good example is, and you've mentioned before, the benefits of testosterone, but you may actually see negative effects with exogenous testosterone, where that can lead to potential negative effects because its response in the body is very different to the endogenous secretion that occurs naturally through cell signaling or in response to, say, resistance training.
Exactly. And that's a good example because, when we started our work and people were concerned that we shouldn't have older men do resistance training because testosterone goes up and that's going to make their prostate cancer take off. So prostate cancer cells need testosterone as a signaling molecule for growth. But again, within the orchestra, when we do resistance training, the concentration of androgen receptors on all of our tissues goes up, in particular muscles. So androgen receptors go up. So you have more of a sink for testosterone. So the result is you have actually less testosterone hitting the prostate than a man that's sitting there on his lounge in front of Netflix, whose testosterone is getting poured out systemically. It's got to go somewhere. And so he's got more of it hitting the potential prostate cancer cells. Again, it's a symphony. You just can't pull out a single instrument or insert a harmonica in the middle of it and expect it to work out well.
Something you mentioned before too, in the management of chronic disease, but also with cancer, is diet. Is this an area of research that you've done in collaboration or in conjunction with, say, training interventions, or have you looked into other research that has been done in terms of diet to help support the management of individuals with cancer?
Yeah, we have from very early on. We were using, continue to use protein supplementation, in particular with our prostate cancer research. So prostate cancer is the most common non-skin cancer in Australia now, and the main treatment of it is androgen deprivation therapy or chemical castration, reduction of testosterone. That causes catastrophic loss of muscle, and so to counteract that, we have to use highly sophisticated resistance training protocols. So we use the hypertrophy program that you would use when you're trying to produce muscle gain in an athlete, and we apply those. But we also do supplementation with protein, and we supplement to anywhere from about 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram per body weight of supplementation each day. And that's just to give make sure we've got an adequate protein availability there. So that's the main work we've been doing. We have tinkered a little bit with creatine supplementation as well. We have a very interesting study. One of our PhD students currently is doing a study in breast cancer, and she's looking at fasting mimicking diet whilst patients are preparing for surgery and they're undergoing what's called neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So they're receiving chemotherapy to try and shrink the tumour before they go in for mastectomy for breast cancer surgery. So that's we're sort of delving into that a little bit. I think there's much more that can be done, and there are other groups around the world doing it. So I think that diet's exceptionally important. I'm not sure I'm a bias again, but for a lot of the morbidities and causes of death in cancer patients, it does tend to be more around exercise medicine as a treatment. We have also done a lot of work, had several trials now looking at caloric restriction. So about 2/3 of men with prostate cancer will be overweight or obese. This is a problem. If they're going to go for surgery, it creates a whole series of problems, as you can imagine. Trying to remove a prostate, a piece of tissue about the size of a walnut, and you're trying to remove it from a man who is obese makes the surgery much more difficult. And so we are looking at rapid weight loss in these men, and the combination of that with resistance training to try and prevent the muscle mass that always occurs. So whenever you try to induce fat loss through dietary restriction or through bariatric surgery or through the new weight loss drugs, the latest weight loss drugs like Wegovy, Ozempic, etc., then the problem with that is that you reduce their caloric intake to the body, but you also lose muscle and bone along with fat. And for a cancer, or for anyone, that's a problem. But for a cancer patient, it's a huge problem because of the strong relationship between muscle mass and their survival outcomes. So we are doing a lot of dietary work there in terms of trying to induce fat loss in men with prostate cancer who are overweight and obese and women with breast cancer at the moment. On the other side of things, we also have done some dietary work. Another one of my PhD students looking at dietary interventions for patients with mesothelioma. So mesothelioma is a very, very difficult cancer. It's caused by exposure to asbestos. Western Australia has the highest incidence in the world. And with these patients, they have very severe cachexia. And so through that work, we were looking to try and slow the loss of body weight, and that was through very targeted diet therapy combined with resistance training again.
You mentioned that one of your PhD students is looking at doing a fasting mimicking diet. When you say that, are they actually fasting, or is it like hypocaloric or like a ketogenic type diet? What exactly are they doing?
It is a hypocaloric diet, but it's around their chemotherapy. So a few days before and a couple of days afterwards, then we transition them down to a very low, very large caloric deficit, if you like. So a very low caloric intake, and then a few days after their chemotherapy, they go back up to a normal diet. So it's cycling their dietary restriction with their chemotherapy.
Are you familiar with any research of looking at a similar diet for any type of surgery? Like I'm even thinking about, say, musculoskeletal or orthopedic surgery, whether you may see a similar effect because it's creating a similar physiological response with, I'm assuming it's related to upregulating autophagy.
That's a good question. I don't go too much into the orthopedic research. I've got to be honest. These days, sort of there's so much going on in the cancer field. It's hard to keep up with that. So no, I'm not familiar with that. I think I will throw in though something I did want to mention is that there's some very, very interesting work being done around plant-based diets, vegan diets around cancer. You can imagine that there's a lot of misinformation out there around different diets and ketogenic diet for people with cancer and a whole range of other things. So there is a lot of good work being done, but unfortunately with a lot of people turn to Dr. Google. And there's also a lot of rubbish out there as well, which is actually making it worse for the patient. It compromises their capacity to survive their cancer as well. But there is definitely good work being done in terms of anti-inflammatory diets. We do know that if a patient moves on to an anti-inflammatory diet, then it will cause cancer suppression, and they will do better. I think the classic study was done in California, where they had men with very early stage prostate cancer. And what they did is they put them on a vegan diet. They had them doing 300 minutes per week or more of exercise. And they had them doing mindfulness and meditation to really bring down their cortisol levels. And in the majority of men, their prostate cancer stopped progressing. So they're actually able to slow that right down. And they saw a whole lot of other very positive changes. So that was a combination of a mental therapy, exercise medicine and diet therapy. But certainly the move to a vegan diet was a considerable contributor, simply because it's bringing down the overall systemic inflammation in the body. And that's a strong mechanism for cancer suppression as well. We don't recommend, it's very difficult for most cancer patients to go onto a full vegan diet. What we recommend to our patients is predominantly their diet should be whole food, plant-based. If it comes in a packet or a box, just don't eat it.
Yeah, exactly. Take out.
Again, it's just trying to bring their level of systemic inflammation down. Yeah. You've got to get your inflammation down. An inflammatory status is not normal. We do have a vast proportion of the population now who have low-level systemic inflammation. And the reason is because they're sedentary and the food that they eat, and also the fact that they might be quite stressed and anxious. So their body is in a flight and fight condition continuously. And then so all of the inflammatory responses are in place. They're in action. And that is a very pro-cancer environment. That's an environment that cancer cells love because they're getting the hormones they need, the signaling they need, or everything they need to grow much, much faster and divide, and for the tumor or the cancer cells to really take off.
A question we like to ask our guests, Rob, is whether you're learning or reading anything in particular outside of your professional work that's sparking your curiosity.
Wow. I spend way too much time reading American politics, so I need to stop doing that because it's making me stressed, particularly for next year, 2024, with the presidential election coming up. So I spend way too much time. But I lived in, my wife and family and I lived in, my family and I lived in the US for such a long time, and we had residency and things like that. So it does feel like sort of like home. So I spend too much time reading about all the shenanigans going on over there in US politics. It seems like a basket case.
That won't reduce your stress, Rob.
What else do I like to read? No, it's not reducing my stress at all. I need to stop doing that. Oh, look, I'm pushing really hard. I know you're spending a lot of time in Italy at the moment. I'm really working on my Italian. So that's a great interest of mine. I just really want to learn Italian. I'm hopeless at languages. Being an Aussie, I'm just monolingual. But I love Italy. And I'm going over there. Next year, I'll be there for 2 months, actually, doing some work at the University of Verona. And hopefully I'll be able to really boost my Italian language skills up.
Yeah, great.
But I like to read everything. I'm an avid reader. I like to read theoretical physics and things like that. I love Brian Greene and what's his name? Stephen Hawking, but I can read about a third of the way through any of their books, and then I have to stop because I don't understand a single word that they're talking about. So my brain capacity only goes so far, and then I have to put the book down because the last 2/3 of the book, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Well, Rob, thank you very much for coming on our podcast. It's great to have your
Pleasure.
wealth of knowledge and be able to share it with our listeners. If people want to find out more about who you are or follow your work, I'm assuming you're on social media, are you?
Yes, so I use Twitter or X, formerly Twitter, and I'm also on Instagram. I post there regularly, but I'm finding now the main social media I use is LinkedIn. So I post a lot on LinkedIn, and of course, if you just reach out, if you just search for me at Edith Cowan University, then I always welcome emails. I get emails from all over the place, and it's great to get emails. In particular, I like to get emails from members of the public who are just asking questions about exercise and medicine.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Rob.
Pleasure, guys. Enjoy your weekend. I'm going to go get on with my day in Hong Kong.
Thank you.
All right, cheers.
All
See you
right.
later.